Another real tragedy we have going on here, Will, is the case of Julian Assange. And I think maybe the biggest tragedy of all of it is just how little coverage it's getting. People are going to talk about 2020 and, oh my God, the coronavirus and this thing happened, the wildfires and this and that. And I guess, the amazing thing to me about 2020 is we could potentially watch the First Amendment vanish while nobody even recognizes, pays attention, or seems to care. And so, I have stories here from Craig Murray at his blog. He's titling his article "Your Man in the Public Gallery," and then Assange hearing day, and then whatever day it is. So this was, I believe, Wednesday's write up. And then I have also Kevin Gunstola's write up from the same day. Doctor diagnosed Julian Assange with Asperger's syndrome. And so I thought that was probably the most interesting thing that happened in Assange's hearings this week, other than maybe the judge making a real push to get this thing over with as soon as possible. But Will, what were your key takeaways from this week?
Yeah. I guess we can go over just a few highlights from what the Assange stuff this week. The first thing I'll mention actually is this letter that like 180 world leaders and diplomats and legal associations and stuff that they all signed demanding Assange's freedom. I thought that was noteworthy. It's a pretty long and substantial document. Some of their main arguments are that like Assange will not face a fair trial in the United States, that he would face like cruel and unusual punishments here, that in solitary confinement and that kind of stuff, and that it's a dire threat to not only press freedom in this country, in the U.S., but all over the planet. Because obviously Assange is not an American citizen; he's an Australian, and all these legal proceedings are happening in the UK. So this is a very international threat, I think. And this letter, they addressed it to Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the UK, trying to ask him to intervene to do something to stop this. I'm not sure at this point if he even could. I guess as the Prime Minister, he probably has quite a bit of leeway. But it was signed by quite a few high profile people. Most of in terms of the heads of state and stuff, it was mostly Latin American leaders. We had the president of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez. We had two former presidents of Brazil. We had Nicolas Maduro, the socialist president of Venezuela. And we also had actually the former leader of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, who actually, I think under his administration, he actually approved Assange's asylum in the embassy in London, only for the traitor Lenin Moreno to come back and to rescind, unfortunately. But I thought that was interesting. That whole letter, I just think if people want to go through that, they actually cite throughout the whole thing. They have footnotes citing UN resolutions and stuff. So they're showing everything we're saying here is backed by international law. So I thought that was a.
I'll just say I believe the two American signatories were former Senator Mike Gravel and former Congressman Ron Paul.
Yeah.
So.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I don't have anything else on the letter. That's all I had to add.
Okay, that's cool.
Well,
I got some more.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in terms of the actual hearings themselves, I think there was some interesting stuff this week too. One of the major themes this week in the testimony, they've had psychiatrists and doctors and stuff testifying, but one of the major themes has been whether Assange is a suicide risk. If he is what is the risk that he'll take his own life if he is indeed sent off to the U.S. to be prosecuted? And you had quite a bit of interesting testimony. You had the psychiatrist who's interviewed Assange 20 separate times, Michael Koppelman, who testified for the defense. And he says that Assange is suffering from severe depression and even psychotic symptoms, where apparently he's written suicide letters to friends and family in jail, preparing for his demise and stuff. And I think he's drawn up a will. But he's also been having auditory hallucinations, apparently, in solitary there in Belmarsh. So if that's any sign to his psychological state, that's not good at all. I mean, auditory hallucinations, that is a sign of psychosis, a severe mental issue there. Then that was on Tuesday. Then the next day, on Wednesday, you had another psychiatrist testifying to the same effect. But as you mentioned, he focused more on the fact that Assange may have some form of autism. I think you said, Asperger's, that might factor into this suicide risk. That might actually increase it. Someone with that kind of disorder. Now, of course, the prosecutor, Lewis, he tried to sort of question this. He tried to say Assange was maybe feigning these symptoms, making it up to try to gain sympathy or something. But Koppelman actually kind of smacked that down in the previous testimony, saying that no, I'm a professional. I've dealt with people who are exaggerating or faking symptoms, and that's not what's happening here. And so he definitely, I think, shot down that argument. They did also, the defense team also got a prosecution witness to admit that he was not familiar with what prison Assange might be sent to. if he were to be extradited. And so that I thought was like a nice blow to the prosecution side, because this guy, his whole, I think part of the whole reason he was called to testify was to comment on like the conditions that Assange might face. And the prosecution called him to say that like, nah, that'll be fine. He's not under that much of a risk. But the defense got him to admit that like maybe I don't actually know that much about the conditions he'll face. So I thought that was a pretty good dunk on the prosecution.
Right. Yeah, I guess to add a little bit to the Asperger's or whatever stuff. So I think from my understanding of working in mental health here in the US is that the UK on mental health, like as far as like perception goes, like public perception goes, and just like I think clinically is a little bit behind the US as far as providing like care, and just like I said, stigma, like the idea of like having mental illness, if it's like something you should be ashamed of or not. So I think that would like that certainly came out some in the cross examination, especially from the prosecutor, who was like asserting that there's no way Julian Assange could be a functioning adult and have Asperger's, or what in the U.S. is now called autism spectrum disorder. He asserted that Assange couldn't understand like what love is, or have a relationship, have meaningful friendships and stuff like. And all of these are things that like I'm pretty sure if this happened in the U.S., it would have been considered offensive by most like progressive-ish people. Like it was pretty bad at times, where how kind of backwards his things were. A couple things that of the testimony that stood out, people talking about Assange, that made me think that maybe this is an accurate diagnosis, as they talked about him like not understanding social cues, like in an early relationship when he was going out to like bars, he would like walk behind the bar and like turn down the music if it was too loud, or change it if he didn't like it. And so that's certainly something that having a history of working with people like who are on the autism spectrum wouldn't surprise me happening. You know what I mean? Like that's the story I hear. I'd be like, oh yeah. And then just like how interpersonal relationships are difficult for him to manage, especially like in-person relationships and stuff like that. Although I did think the lawyer's testimony, when John Lewis was asking him about John Lewis is the prosecutor, about how could he possibly like hold a press conference, or be at an event and like talk to hundreds of people with having this diagnosis. And the guy was like, that's not a problem. But the prosecutor seems to think that like autism means essentially like severe Down syndrome, and like if you're not drooling on yourself, then you don't have this. Kevin Gostola did a great interview on the Scott Horton show and point out the reason that this is so important is that I guess the UK has denied 2 extraditions to the US, and both were computer hackers, and both extraditions were denied, in part at least because the people who were set to be extradited had some kind of developmental disability like autism, and it was determined that they essentially wouldn't receive the care they needed in a U.S. prison, which is absolutely true.
Yeah.
When I was working at mental health, I had people like end up, going to prison for various things. And while you're in prison, if like, let's say you're on psychiatric meds, they don't let you take your normal meds. You have to take whatever like prisons prescribed generic is. And I guess I mean generic in the sense like, it's not the name brand that you're used to, but also like it kind of doesn't work as well, because anything that works well also usually has some kind of other recreational benefits or something like that, or people will look to sell it, stuff like that.
Right,
And
benzo,
so,
stuff like that.
yep. So any kind of sleeping medication that maybe you need to sleep, anti-anxiety medication, you can't have it in prison. Some of the antipsychotics as well, antidepressant meds, all that kind of stuff. They give you really, really light stuff, and it has to be hell for anybody. Not to mention that, a lot of people, especially if Assange is exhibiting any psychiatric or psychotic symptoms, like those kind of medications that people prescribe for that, work very, very particularly on the brain. And so, one medication may work really well, but if you prescribe somebody the generic version of that same medication, it may not work at all. And these are the kinds of things that are stripped from people when they enter American prisons, is their effective medications. In fact, I was once in a courtroom while some older gentleman was, I guess, on his like 5th DUI, but hadn't had any in 30 years. This guy was like 80 and had heart conditions, and the judge was saying they had to spend a mandatory 14-day in prisons. and and then there was like an issue around his heart medication, like that what medication he wouldn't be able to have in jail. And the judge was like, "Well, there's nothing I could do. You got to go to jail for 14 days." And the guy was like, "But I can't take my heart medication in jail. Like I'm gonna die." And the judge was like, "Well, the best I could do is give it another month, and you could work something out with your doctor." I'm not sure what his doctor's gonna do to make a magical medicine in that
Cut a
amount of
deal with him or
time,
yeah, what?
right? But yeah, but these are the kind of things that people face in U.S. prisons, and it's absolutely insane. And maybe that's the kind of thing that would get Assange off. Now, Kevin pointed out that these things happened at like the highest level of the UK court and not at the level that we're currently at, and that there's appeals and stuff to come. So I don't know. I just thought all that was very interesting. I want to give a little bit of what my thoughts were on that. Anything else
Yeah.
on Assange this week, Will?
Yeah, there's one last thing that I wanted to mention. I think it was Wednesday, the hearing on Wednesday. They requested the defense side had requested from the judge Baritzer that like after the testimony is done, could we have a month delay to like prepare for the latest superseding indictment? And the defense had already previously asked for some kind of delay, like at the already they were turned down. And unfortunately, I think the judge has now turned that down too. And she says that like they will have to prepare and submit their final like arguments but on the week of October 5th. So it really does not give them a whole lot of time after the testimony is finished for them to wrap that up and to get that finished. So that is unfortunate. They said that it would cause, quote, massive problems for the defense. And she said, too bad.
Yeah, well, yeah, that was the last thing I was going to add is just how much the judge is trying to rush the end of this thing. Apparently, there's a lot of witnesses still to be called, and that some of them may no longer be called, including Noam Chomsky and
Yeah.
Patrick Coburn. Potentially not being called. Other witnesses are going to just have their statements read or kind of, quickly brushed aside. I think that's what happened to Cassandra Fairbanks. And it just seems like, her goal at this point is to rush through it. The thing that I found most notable about what you pointed out, Will, is what was, rushing the closing arguments. One that I think points the defense was trying to make is that, we've heard all this testimony, so the hearings are going to the witnesses are going to be heard through next Friday, and then starting the next week they want to do closing arguments. And they essentially said, we need more time to prepare because of the superseding indictment and because of all the things that the witnesses have said. Well, it's now become clear that the judge doesn't care what the witnesses have said because they don't get extra time to prepare from there. But the thing is that this seems like kind of the prosecution slash courts effort to railroad Assange this whole time was kind of set behind this whole, we're just gonna make this happen as soon as everything as quickly as possible, and for people to have information, at as slow as pace as possible at the latest possible date. There's a lot of witnesses who have reported getting like multi-hundred page packets from the prosecution within like a day or the day of their scheduled to go on the stand and testify and stuff like that. That's crazy. Like, and then the prosecution will ask him about, oh, did you read this and this and this? I would be like, no, if you send me more than 100 pages in the day, I'm not going to read it all in principle. Because, I can't get through all this. I'm not going to look through it. You got to give me enough time to look at the information if you want me to testify to it. And then at times the prosecution tries to, criticize them for not having processed all the information and stuff like that. It's really, reading up the reports from Craig Murray and Kevin Gustola every day have been absolutely shocking. Joe Loria is also doing a great job covering this. Oh, I know. The last thing I want to add is I caught this on Joanne Leone's Around the Empire podcast when she was interviewing Kevin, and he said that it was getting, I think, to be like a few weeks before the trial was supposed to start. And he actually is the one who requested from the court to have remote access because of COVID. And I guess he hired a lawyer to facilitate his request to the court and everything. And it's crazy to me that, first of all, the guy that runs Shadowproof, this is a major U.S. news site, is the one that has to do this, and how important it is to support different kinds of independent media, because if Kevin didn't have people support, he couldn't have hired that lawyer. And then who knows that there would be like this public access as good as they have it, which isn't that great as is. but
Right.
that there is some access for people to apply to get to get a remote feed of the Assange hearing. That way somebody could bring us the story of what's going on in the courtroom.
Yeah, we'd be just guessing and speculating at this point. We wouldn't even have any updates to give because there'd be nothing coming out of there.
Right? Yeah, it'd just be Craig Murray's, I guess, who's actually gotten into the courtroom a few
Right, right.
times. Or yeah, I think even he doesn't get in the actual courtroom. I think he's in like an
There's like a
adjacent
screening
room.
room.
Yeah, and he's in
Yeah,
there, but
exactly.
at least he's there and kind of a part of it. But yeah, it's just so disappointing. There's so little coverage. But
Good on
well,
Kevin though. Good on Kevin Gostola for doing
yeah,
that, man. That's real yeoman's work.
we should wrap it here and just remind everybody to check out Will on Twitter at the Will Porter. Will writes up the news at RT, and so you can't actually find his name on the articles he writes, but he tweets them all out or puts them on Facebook every day. So follow him in any of those places, you'll find that. I'm at Kyle Anzalone _ on Twitter. I am the news editor at the Libertarian